to the groove of that piece, we begin our session this evening, and it's really quite exciting to be here. So get yourself ready, relax, pretend we're in the same room and we're about to celebrate, and get ready for a conversation. Confronting and accepting difference might teach us more about our sameness under the skin, about the continued building of consciousness across borders, page 142. The engagement with the rules of difference across boundaries of class, ethnicity, nation, economic divides, and across masculinity itself forces a reflexivity about the inevitability of power in social relations, and at the same time must also free us from becoming immobilized as a result of such complexity. Page 147. Difference and power remain central, not just to feminist battles, but to a range of current global confrontations. Feminisms are not exempt from these erupting forces. They are transformed and implicated in ways that continue to create the basis for further difference. Page 158. This border crossing, this reflexivity, this transformation and possible freedom, these erupting forces we unpackage in our reasonings this evening. We come together for more than a book launch, a vibrant conversation on the writing of gender in the Caribbean through selected essays for the period 1988 to 2020. I am Ann Barratt, current head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, and it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to embed yourself in our contemplations. Share your views, question understandings, forecast our futures. Together, we connect these writings to our own musings. We speak as one, knowing that we speak across differences. To begin our conversation, I am very pleased to invite greetings from IGDS University Director, Professor Paula Morgan, who is Professor of West Indian Literature and Culture. Professor Morgan's research extends to gender violence and trauma, crime and its representation in the Anglophone Caribbean, and pedagogical approaches to Caribbean literature and culture. She's well published over numerous essays and over 10 publications, including The Terror and the Time, Banal Violence and Trauma in Caribbean Discourse. It is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Professor Morgan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barratt. I'm delighted to be here this evening to lend my voice to the chorus of congratulations being extended to my colleague, Professor Patricia Mohammed, for yet another landmark achievement. I welcome this compilation for numerous reasons. The sheer birthing capacity which Professor Mohammed and those stalwarts who founded and superintended the early developmental pathways of the Caribbean women's movement in general, and the IGDS in particular, calls for careful documentation. Patricia Mohammed is numbered prominently among those who carefully guided the process, which has left a series of vigorous and healthy institutes which continue to make a substantial impact on the University of the West Indies. But memory is short-lived, and too often it is embodied. The Caribbean women's movement has come of age. Unless its carefully charted trajectories and successes, its bunny trails and lapses are well documented, we will soon lose hold of its strands and find ourselves disconnected from our moorings, unsure of our current footing, bewildered about where we are headed. We are grateful for this volume, which traces Caribbean discourse over decades. It promises to be a roadmap that will keep us walking firmly and securely. This we need to guide our pathways into increasingly uncertain futures. We need to be reminded of the processes which dictate that our contemporary thinking must be about gender, why masculinity studies remain high on our agendas, why gains hard won must not be taken for granted, and why, despite decades of hard work and activism, we cannot rest and assume that any facet of this ground has been taken definitely or for all time. This kind of work confirms while the struggle for gender equity must continue, and while the baton must be effectively passed on to another generation. I note, and I quote from the blurb, that the essays move between historical, biographical, popular culture, and a visual arts lens, revealing an intersectional analysis that is central to the understanding of this region and to the current global condition. And this is so like Professor Patricia, who has never lived within a box, never walked a single pathway, never settled within a single discipline or medium or framework of thinking. So congratulations, Prof. Mohammed, and thank you for being a woman of all seasons. You're an amazing mentor and role model as you nudge us into new challenges, show us how to flourish and bear good fruit graciously, and how to continue beyond the years to unstintingly support our institutional advancement. You are simply inspirational. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Professor Morgan. Staying vigilant as we are guided by a woman of all seasons indeed. Before we continue with our program, let me recognize especially Professor Elsa Leo-Riney. Welcome, Prof. Also, Aisha Khan, who is here and who wrote one of the back cover blurbs. We're so thankful to have you with us. We're very pleased to welcome Christine Sahadio, Judge of the Tax Court in Trinidad and Tobago, and Christine Randall. We're very pleased to have you as well. A special pleasure for Professor Mohammed. In addition, we're very happy to welcome PVC Dr. Stacy Richards Kennedy to our musings this evening, our conversations and our discoveries as we move on this path to the future. And I said we were having a conversation, and at this point, we're having a conversation between professors. This conversation is around writing and publishing as activism. Often there is this perception that the two are separate, but our professors across the board have demonstrated that such a separation is a myth. So it is my pleasure to bring together our esteemed author, Professor Mohammed, and her long-standing colleague, Professor Barriteau, to converse in this first segment of Conversations. By way of introduction, you know very well Professor Patricia Mohammed, who is Emerita Professor at the University of the West Indies. She is a multidisciplinary scholar, writer, and filmmaker with a focus on gender and cultural studies. This publication, Writing Gender into the Caribbean, is her latest of many publications. In fact, she's currently writing a biography of Janet Jagan, the first female president of Guyana. And she will be discussing some key points in the book with her long colleague, Professor Barriteau. Professor Eudine Barriteau is a renowned Caribbean feminist scholar and activist and senior education administrator. She's well published, up to 37 book chapters and peer-reviewed articles, including her first book, The Political Economy of Gender in the 20th Century Caribbean. I'm sure you would have read it. As a professor of gender and public policy, her research interests encompass transformational educational leadership, feminist theorizing, feminist investigations of the Caribbean political economy, and the intersections of gender analysis and public policy. In the 2019 independence celebrations, the government of Barbados conferred on Professor Barriteau the Order of Freedom of Barbados, the country's highest national honor. She's also honored in her invitation to speak in this book launch with one of her friends. She is one of the pioneers of feminism in the Caribbean, and for this, her groundbreaking role is important. She introduced, expanded, and continued advancement of women and pursued gender and development studies in the region and elsewhere. So to set this conversation ago, I invite Professor Mohammed.
Good evening, everyone. Very warm greetings to all of those who have joined us and to my colleagues who will speak. I am honored that you have taken the time off on a Friday evening to spend with us. Forgive me if I leave my thanks and thanksgiving for the end of this session. I hope you will all stay with us to the end and only depart from this to recognize my father, Mr. Ayub Mohammed, to whom this book is dedicated. And I read from the acknowledgements here. Born in 1931, he was among the early group of Indo-Trinidadian primary school teachers trained for rural schools in Trinidad, along with my mother, Zuleika, who is now deceased, a champion for the education of his 4 daughters and 1 son. His interest in writing and painting unconsciously inspired me very early in life, while his early involvement in community work, without a doubt, infected the activist in my soul. Thank you for joining us, Dad, today. And forgive me, colleagues, for the emotion that brought up. I also acknowledge my sisters, Ramona Mohammed, who is there, and my other sister, Zafura Chan, who is also in the audience. So I did want to get my family involved, and so please forgive me for this. Right, so I move on to the more formal part now. My voice also stops cracking. So to contextualize the delivery by my good friend and colleague in the trenches of gender and university administrative activism for decades, Professor Eudine Barriteau, I would like to read this excerpt from the introduction to the book. The last 2 decades of the 20th century marked a founding moment for gender scholarship in the Caribbean. The act of writing and publishing was as much a political strategy as it was a necessity. My earliest colleagues in this fellowship of the pen and keyboard all knew that we had to lay claim to our knowledge, to our histories, our culturally shaped gender tropes, to refine the literary canon, genderize the classrooms and boardrooms, and excavate a parallel political economy of the region. Perhaps the closest affinities developed among those who headed the first centers for gender and development studies from 1993. Among these, I signal Eudine Barriteau, Elsa Leorini, Rhoda Reddock, and Barbara Bailey. Above all other objectives, we had to erect a foundational and conceptual scaffold that was an apposite for Caribbean-centered conversation in the midst of a competitive global discourse that could otherwise subsume us as island girls inhabiting a minor demographic exception. In scribbling gender into different formats, we had to reach the widest group of constituents, students, gender scholars, globally and regionally, skeptical colleagues, feminist activists, government officials, media personnel, and the public. Writing styles and rhetoric varied, forcing us to refine our gender arguments, expand our disciplinary range, and sharpen our wits to suit the audience. I certainly do not claim to be the only. While I have titled this book, I do not claim to be the only or even original scribe, and pay homage to those who have also been very much part of this project alongside me. So I welcome Professor Barriteau, who was equally and very much part of the struggles in the trenches, and look forward to your comments. Over to you, Eudine.
Thank you very much, Pat. Good evening, everyone, and a special good evening to the Mohammed clan. I am always thrilled when family is centered. I want to congratulate Pat, Professor Mohammed, on the publication of this collection of essays with the provocative title of Writing Gender into the Caribbean. The title signals an epistemological project and simultaneously a recognition that gender is already there, and the act of writing is actually an act of excavating and exposing gender in the Caribbean. I also want to thank her for providing us with a critical body of work spanning 4 decades of eclectic and incisive feminist scholarship. I also want to thank her for inviting me to be part of this launch, for forcing me to engage with feminist scholarship during a period of self-imposed leave, having just recently retired. I have no regrets, because having read the first 4 essays and have concentrated on those in this collection, it brought back to me the joys and intellectual stimulation of feminist research, debates, conference presentations, and graduate teaching. So Pat, I want to thank you for that. I have also been asked to speak in the context of what it was like for us as one of the 3 founding heads of IGDS in the early 90s, building feminist scholarship in the academy, dealing with some degree of academic and public hostility, and nurturing as best as we could coalitions and collaborations with activists, women's group, women and feminist organizations. And I think that collectively we did a good enough job on that. I will make a comment on this, but I am far more fascinated by what the collection reveals and the gifts Professor Mohammed has provided us. So I will concentrate on that. And the point I want to make in relation to the task is that I want to say that, of course, we were passionate, the founding heads and professors and the leadership, we were passionate, committed, and driven to put CGDS, IGDS on the academic and activist map from the vantage point of an academic location, and to fully occupy that. But I do not think there's anything unique in what we did. And let me explain what I mean. I believe the IGDS was, the IGDS was started today, if it did not exist before now, this year, with the current university colleagues that we have, they would be passionate, committed, and driven to establish and put the IGDS on the map, because they are driven, passionate, and committed, just as we were. And just as we built on the scholarship we unearthed in the intersecting disciplinary locations and made our own substantial contributions, they would do the same. I have no doubt of that. We were fortunate because we were the pioneers, we were there. But I am fully convinced that my colleagues in the IGDS now would do the same thing and engage with the same historical and contemporary realities in this contemporary moment, because they would have no choice. They would have to do it just like we had no choice. So I think we would always be the pioneers, but we dealt with what existed at the time. And if the IGDS was coming into being today, I am fully convinced that that same approach would be taken. Now I want to turn to this collection. Pat gives us with a unique vantage point from which she sought to understand and contribute to scholarship on relations of gender in Caribbean society. As a result, the collection should be mandatory reading for courses examining advanced feminist theory at the graduate level in the Caribbean and internationally. When I read again, I want to teach from this collection. I want graduate students especially to interrogate the essays and deploy the analyses in advancing their own scholarship and developing their own contributions to knowledge. And I've been ambivalent about whether or not I want to teach, and this makes me feel like I would teach. And so this is a very sophisticated exposition on Caribbean feminist thought up to the late 20th century. It is retrospective, and there are numerous filters that can be applied to unearth and reveal the valuable insights into Caribbean feminist theorizing and understanding Caribbean societies. Take, for example, a statement Professor Mohammed makes, and I quote, "In a contemporary sense, the Caribbean appears more a political space rather than a geographical entity." And this is on page 52 in the essay Towards Indigenous Caribbean Feminist Theorizing. Immediately, I think of exploring with a class the many Caribbeans at play. And just reading this, I thought of 5. The messy Caribbean, of where people of different classes, ethnicities, race, gender identities, live and experience daily. 2, a diaspora Caribbean kept alive by Caribbean diasporas that is very real. 3, the Caribbean of the travel industry that goes beyond the, like the old tourism marketing slogan of Barbados that used to say, just beyond your imagination. It is saturated with rum, sex, steel band, soca, dancehall, sand, sunset, escapism, and imposed oversimplification. 4, what I call the UN Caribbean, small island developing states, failed states, middle-income states, CARICOM, UN, UNCTAD, WTO, E2, ACP. And 5th, the geopolitical Caribbean, sovereign countries with ideal or troubling locations, depending on who want to use us. 15 independent sovereign votes at the UN, the US backdoor, powerful voting bloc. Now, just from that statement, I've isolated 5 renderings of the Caribbean, and in each configuration, each invocation is saturated or embedded with relations of gender. Now, how are relations of gender prefigured in these constructions? And that from what Professor Mohammed has offered us. Each observation made by Pat in each essay is loaded with points of engagement and points of departure. In the process, the collection as a body of work solidifies the sterling contribution to Caribbean feminist scholarship, and Caribbean scholars or scholars who are interested in the Caribbean have to take this on board. I think Pat also has implicitly used creolization as a metaphor for hybridity and a critical entry point for her theorizing. But still, Pat, I think this use of creolization needs a more frontal engagement. I welcome by you a fuller engagement as to why you are drawn to creolization as an entry point to analyzing historical and contemporary gender relation. This, of course, is a very legitimate area of investigation as all fields and conceptual sites. And what I'm speaking to in terms of a more fuller engagement, I am not speaking of a self-aware personal accountability. I am identifying a more fundamental aspect of creating knowledge that you speak to in over 2 to 3 of the essays. Why should we take on creolization? And I think we should. And I think you have started. I'm asking for a deeper exploration. And I think in terms of how I'm seeing it, is what is missing if we do not take historical and contemporary manifestations of creolization on board. What are you seeking to make available to knowledge on Caribbean relations of gender as mediated through the commingling of class, race, and power? I felt this even more strongly, and the need for a fuller engagement with the attraction of this vantage point that you employ in the article, but most of all, I love my Browning, the emergence of the mulatto women. And I felt that you come close, and so that on page 81, you suggest a fuller engagement, and I quote, recognizing the desirability of the mulatto or mixed race woman in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean still obtains, I want to investigate the conditions in the past which may have influenced ideas and constructs of desire and into the present. And I say, good, Pat is getting into it. And then immediately I think that you pulled away, because immediately you went into, and I quote again, the exploration is an asymmetrical interplay between past and present. And despite its title, must be viewed as neither historical or sociological, but rather contemplative of how contemporary gender relations need to be processed through ongoing constructions, end of quote. Now, I think that stating the work is neither historical or sociological, but instead contemplative, does not in itself make it so. What feminist historical tools are being brought to bear on the records? What feminist sociological insights are used to filter contemporary realities? one may remain contemplative in the sense of maintaining, in fact, nurturing a legitimate rumination and reflection on the subject, but what feminist perspectives and or analytical frameworks, ideologies, assumptions, and knowledge claims inform that contemplation. The contemplation is occurring from some implicit or explicit perspective, and this example again underscores why this text should be read by feminist theorists and Caribbean scholars and taught in graduate courses regionally and internationally. It indicates the many layers and filters through which knowledge claims can be evaluated and through which generalizations are produced. I'm going to stop here because in terms of time, but in wrapping up at this point, I want to say this is a very exciting work, and it is a gift that keeps on giving, and that I think all graduates, I keep saying graduate because I think a level of analysis is needed to come and really engage, but it's a text that I would love to get into a classroom with. And I want to thank you very much, Pat, for gifting us with this collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barriteau. And you can get this gift in hard copy, currently at paper-based, at Hotel Normandy, St. Anne's, Port of Spain. It costs $350. You can also go online. You can get hard copies from Hansard Publications, or you can go to Amazon, and the Kindle price is $9.99 US. So the gift is available to you. At this point, following that very vibrant and thorough evaluation, I think the one thing that comes to us is that it is a tool as we progress. And as I said, we want to imagine our futures as much as we critique what is there. We've learned so much from this conversation between Prof. Mohammed and Prof. Barriteau. We turn now to several contributors, several scholars, several thinkers who will contemplate Prof's work through multiple sections. When you get your copy of the book, you will notice it is broken up into a series of sections, 5 in all. Section 1 covers originary narratives and a political grammar for Caribbean feminism. Section 2, Indo-Caribbean feminist intersections. 3, inviting masculinity. 4, drafting gender equality frameworks. And 5, gender and cultural storytelling. So in our next segment, what we're going to have is each contributor, each respondent, each thinker, each person engaging in their own reasonings will speak for 5 minutes, 5 to 7, and then we will move on to an open conversation. To begin our musings, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Diana Fox. Professor Fox is a professor of anthropology, a cultural decolonial feminist scholar activist, anthropologist, and documentary filmmaker. Her work in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago over the last 3 decades has focused on issues of gender and sexual diversity, sexual citizenship, HIV/AIDS education, transnational feminisms, women's social movement activism for ecological sustainability, and the human rights of girls and women. Professor Fox is the founder and editor of the Open Access Online Journal of International Women's Studies since 1999. Professor Fox, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with everybody. It's also quite an honor to be here, having first read your work, Pat, in 1999 or so when I was a graduate student, and then finally meeting you in 2004 when I was a Fulbright scholar at what was then CGDS, and then finally traveling with you and Suanne and Angelique to Sri Lanka, the subject of chapter 5, which was quite stunning for me to read, such a joy. I will begin by saying that as I read this first section of your book, I imagined myself on a non-linear journey in a time capsule with you, moving back and forth across the arc of your ideas. Starting then with chapter 5, Professor Mohammed asks, how can feminism contend with differences among women so that it is less fractured? a question that has been asked since Black abolitionist feminists were abandoned in the first wave. Yet Pat asks in a question informed by Caribbean feminism, how are those differences constituted by power and histories of nation? How are those differences expressed in lived experiences being the impetus, she reminds us through the chapters, for women's movement-driven legislation? Most pressingly, how can we understand one another across our differences, building solidarities without reifying those very power relationships that feminisms claim they seek to disrupt? Throughout, we see how feminists also pose new questions, stretched by issues of gender and sexual diversity, embarking on the decolonial project of building coalitions that embrace differences through what Maria Lugones terms deep listening. This involves a consideration of the various places where we originate, informing our sensibilities. While we continue to contend with old questions and challenges, new questions mark a growth in feminist consciousness in meeting the, quote, political challenge of feminism through its reconstruction of knowledge and understanding of power, as Pat says in chapter 4, to the survival of the species and threats to peace. Indeed, newer iterations of feminist knowledge seeking, such as eco and indigenous feminisms, seek to unite us through threats that human beings pose to all species. How have we arrived at these important challenges, yet unborn in the early 19th century diary of Lady Nugent, the wife of General Nugent, governor of Jamaica from 1801 to 1805, the subject of chapter 1? Here, Pat brings to fruition a second wave feminist historical rereading of the diary to explicate the profoundly raced, gendered, and classed claims to domination through enslavement of Africans that positioned white English bodies as civilized and Black bodies as savage, childish. Pat demonstrates how to engage these three positionalities intersectionally in ways that remain critical. Here we have a complex rendering of white patriarchal settler colonialism as an ideological apparatus, not only produced by the emerging capitalist state, but, as Pat illuminates, through the collusion of white aristocratic women in their raced and classed domination over domesticity and reproductive spaces. It is tempting to write the history of feminist thought as a linear unfolding, but dangerous to do so, lest we fall prey to the same insidious civilizing mission mentality, not only of Lady Nugent's time, but still with us today. We must resist the linear narrative, recognizing that a question Pat asks in chapter 5, what do we hear when we ask or learn about other people's experiences, while eluding Lady Nugent, is inherent in both feminist anthropological perspectives and in Sojourner Truth's demand for equality when she rhetorically asks in a new, more accurate rendering of her 1851 speech, I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? Questions about our differences have long been posed by Black and Caribbean feminisms in ways that white liberal feminism has ignored, co-opted by the hegemony of coloniality. Indigenous Caribbean feminisms are the product of the different positionings of history, of nation, and identities. Crafting a cartography of Caribbean feminism in chapter 2 underscores the central place of the materiality of reappropriated labor, colonial legacies of identity construction, and the political urgency of the movement, characterized by what writer, philosopher Edward Glissant argues is the desire of Caribbean peoples to possess their world and their lived experience. Issues, Pat writes, of political nation, race, and sisterhood among women were central to Caribbean feminist organizing for the early leaders of the movement, and whose own history reminds us of the hubris of a linear narrative, especially as we consider the pathways of global feminisms. In chapter 4, Pat asserts that it is necessary to establish boundaries of identity and expanded notions of difference with respect to the political goals of equality. 15 years later, however, in chapter 5, we muse together if it is possible or even desirable to establish such boundaries. Today, many are asking how we can create coalitions and platforms of equality that have built into them open and fluid boundaries of identity with expanded notions of difference, demanding political and legal responsiveness to them. How can this happen? I have a few ideas that I will have to wait to share in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fox. And as we proceed, before we proceed, I'm so pleased to recognize our esteemed Professor Barbara Bailey. Welcome, welcome to our launch, as well as Professor Mohammed's longtime friend, Judith Weatherburn. A lot of friends here today. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Delia Bean, current acting head of the IGDS NBU unit, Dr. Halima Deschamps, who is on leave and to return in that post, Professor Jessica Byron, our colleague from the Institute for International Relations, all our colleagues from the region who are here with us, Jamaica, Barbados, St. Augustine. We are very pleased also to have Joy Mahabia from the USA. As we go through, we see so many people who come together, albeit remotely, to spend some time with us. We also are seeing some of our activists, friends and family, Gayatri Pargas, Jackie Burgess, and Falade Matoto. We're so happy to have you with us this evening. So that was section 1, summarized well by Professor Fox, and Professor Fox further conversation to come up as we enter into conversation. It is now my pleasure to welcome in her discussion of section 2, Dr. Gabrielle Hossain. Dr. Hossain is the co-editor of 2 collections, Indo-Caribbean Feminisms, Charting Crossings in Geography, Discourse, and Politics, and Indo-Caribbean Feminist Thought, Genealogies, Theories, Enactments. Her publications include No Pure Place of Resistance, Reflections on Being Miss Tana Bahar, 2000, Modern Negotiations, Indo-Trinidadian Girlhood and Gender Differential Creolization, Democracy, Gender, and Indian Muslim Modernity in Trinidad, A Letter to My Great-Grandmother, Post-Indentureship Caribbean Feminist Thought, and more. She's co-executive editor of the journal, The Caribbean Review of Gender Studies. And of course, you must have read her blog, Diary of a Mothering Worker, which is an established column published weekly in one of our local national newspapers, the Newsday. Dr. Hossain.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barrett. Welcome all, good evening. Professor Mohammed, it's lovely to be here with you all tonight. For those students who grew up amidst the writings of Professor Patricia Mohammed, who sat poring over her words as we anxiously finished theses, this book feels like coming home. The house is familiar, like Mrs. Naipaul's, appearing as a peculiarly Trinidadian aesthetic of a blended culture, comprising myth and symbol, history and memories, sociological observations and questions, and attention to both traditions and change. I think now, more than 30 years after some of these pioneering essays were published, another generation may take for granted their value and insights, documenting indentured women's ways of challenging, resisting, and accommodating, charting changes over the 20th century, and highlighting the concerns, voices, and complexities of Indian women and men. These seem to us today to be well-known areas of knowledge, but that is the contribution of these essays, that they have become familiar, foundational, and no longer marginal representations and analyses of an Indian Caribbean experience. They feel like a family album over which so many have pored, soon enough adding our own pictures. I first read these essays around 2000 and have returned to them again and again, particularly Professor Mohammed's theorization of an interlocked creolization and modernization, and of course, her valuable application of the concept of gender negotiations to the domestic and public lives of Indian men and women between 1917 and 1947. Even as I reread these essays, I'm reminded that my own ideas would not have existed without them. Were creolization and modernization equivalently interlocked for Indian adolescent girls and boys? differently negotiating reputation and respectability and honor and shame? I asked in my MPhil thesis. When did gender negotiations evolve into gender and later feminist navigations? I wondered in the Indo-Caribbean Feminist Thought Collection, which grew out of a symposium called Beyond Gender Negotiations, and which Lisa Auta and I saw as the work of recognizing Professor Mohammed's place, for me, personally, politically, and intellectually, primus inter pares, in a homegrown Indo-Caribbean feminist intellectual tradition. I use the metaphor of an album because Mohammed's writing has always had a visual quality, and indeed other works, books and essays have explored images, art, and aesthetic, showing a space for and a way of coming to know the Caribbean, which Professor Mohammed herself has returned to again and again. This style of thinking has also led to her turn to flims, as she would often call them, such as A Different Imagination, the lyrical docu-poem, Coolie Pink and Green, and the intimate collaboration between Pat's husband, Rex Dixon, and Maestro, Mungo Patesa, in 17 colors and a sitar. If you read Mohammed's writing, you also understand why and how she paints. The essays are descriptively rich and thoughtful, no doubt providing a lens for later scholars who themselves meandered through images, albums, and archives in the ways that Prof would have collected oral histories, colonial records, and photographs. And as emerging graduate students such as Renuka Ananjit and Shalini Bahadur of the IGDS, Professor Mohammed's own institutional home, are now setting out to do. There are 5 essays republished in this section of the book. The Creolization of Indian Women, published in 1988, is a foundational text, recognizing that Indian women's affirmation of their national identity does not automatically mean a negation of ethnic or religious identity. The second essay on gender, ethnicity, and class sets an example for what scholarship on the Indo-Caribbean should do, which is examine the real life experiences of women and men, their own understandings of their lives, and the complexity of human relations. Mohammed's third essay on writing gender into history remains as productive as when those ideas were first published in her thesis, which opened with a photo of her mother and father, an unforgettable one. As Mohammed points out, although women and men may be born into a certain set of social arrangements not of their choice, their lives can be viewed in terms of how they use these arrangements to get the best out of them, to fight against them, or be defeated by them, how they may use parts and reject others. And while her work pays attention to gender relations among women and men throughout, there is always recognition of the power, aspirations, possibilities, and journeys of women. What does this collection offer for another generation? These republished essays remind us to strip away stereotypes and examine the details of Indo-Caribbean women's lives, not as passive actors, but at times conceding to circumstances that were beyond their control, at others determining their own goals. To observe relations across gender and sexuality in ways that rewrite the patriarchal contract, to unpack mythology, popular culture, and religious doctrine, and to write in a way that leaves others with a vividly imagined sense of the Indian community observed, and to write with words that just as much, but differently, feel like home. Thank you, Professor Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hossain. Indeed, a reminder to move away and examine these stereotypes. So that's section 2 down, and we are moving to a third section on masculinity. And it is my pleasure to invite Professor Mohammed's longtime partner in crime and co-producer, Mr. Michael Mulida. Michael is an award-winning British and Trinidadian director and producer whose work includes documentaries, music videos, and film. He made his directorial debut in 2008 with Queens of Curep, following the lives of transvestite prostitutes in a city center called Curep. His first feature film, Green Days by the River, opened the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival in 2017, winning People's Choice Award, Best Feature Film Narrative, and Best Trinidad and Tobago Feature Film. He has collaborated with Prof on notable works such as Coolie Pink and Green, 17 Colors and a Sitar, The Cool Boys, and City on the Hill. They are currently doing even more work on a film titled As I Was Going to St. Ives. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Michael Mulida.
Hi, good night, everyone. I'm very excited to be here and very honored to be on such a panel with many giants. For the first time in a while, I feel actually very nervous after hearing everybody talk, and I felt like I learned a lot from all of the presenters so far. I'm going to take it a little different just because I approached this with my a little bit more of my filmmaker lens, and Prof gave me a section that was very interesting, which was inviting masculinity. And, you know, I could just say something that Dr. Gabby just said, which was, she said, what does this work offer to future generations? And I think I don't know if I'm a future generation, I might be a little older, but for me, having not had a great knowledge or done a lot of extensive research on Dr. Eric Williams, this chapter that is titled, put it up here real quickly, A Very Public Private Man, Sketches in a Biography of Eric Eustace Williams. For me, it was like such an experience, because I am born in 1985 and I seen Eric Williams pass in 81. But when I read this, I took that journey of seeing Professor Mohammed peel back the layers of masculinity, of class, of race. And I felt like I took this journey about discovery of Dr. Eric Williams, one that I didn't even know I didn't really have an opinion on him. So I feel like this decided to give me this foundation towards Dr. Eric Williams. And I'll just read like a little things I highlighted, but I really enjoyed learning about this man and him going QRC. And you could almost see he's such like an alpha male from even then being the captain of the football team and coming first in class, winning the Island Skull, his competitive nature. I really went on this journey to the point that when, you know, it have a section with pictures, and being a visual person, I was very moved by that because you even saw the first draft writings of Inward Hunger. And I've seen a film on Inward Hunger, but what I thought was so interesting about that is you could actually see the scratches from his writing and his work. And you could see where he was thinking something, crossed it out, pivoted, and wrote something else. And I think that's a very intimate, kind of interesting experience. So for me, this chapter alone really, I think, changed my relationship to Dr. Eric Williams. And then also, of course, you know, just something that I highlighted, the concept of gender appears to apply only to women, as if men have no gender or as if masculinity itself cannot be problematized. In the discourse of gender, I deal with Eric Williams as a man among men and among women and interrogate indirectly the problem of masculinity and power. I do not deal extensively with theoretical debates on either race or gender. You know, so Prof kind of really set up how she's going to handle this chapter. And why begin as I get more experience and get older? Why begin to see these connections? Because this period, this book talking about, is a period when I made Green Days by the River, which deals with 1952, Trinidad and Tobago. So now it's like almost like this full circle type of feeling I have, understanding what our political you know, what the political time was like while, you know, these characters that I'm dealing with. And then, you know, Professor Mohammed throughout my career has, I think, pointed me like to ask questions I didn't know I wanted to ask, even about masculinity, because when you look at the films from Cool Boys and all these films, Queens of Curep, Green Days by the River, I think I am approaching this question of, without knowing it, of, you know, how to become a man and what is masculinity. And to me, this book represents a missing piece of that puzzle for me, that of curiosity that I have been trying to figure out and along that journey. So I think it's a very important piece. And, I would just say this chapter is one that I think is a very important one and one that should be read. I don't want to use up too much time, but I'll just show, that is the actual writings that I was so moved by, and the ability to see, and even these pictures. And so when I read it, it put me in a place where I felt sad when I saw his coffin, because Prof really, I think what Prof masterfully did was kind of acknowledge that in what hunger is his own curation, and Prof is now poking the holes and exploring what wasn't written in that book. So it's kind of almost this extension, right? Prof, I hope I said everything correct with that. But but really and truly, I felt like I went on this journey, and I think it's provided this foundation for now. When I encounter more information, I have this foothold of understanding to build upon. And that's why it ties into what Gabby was saying. I think I'm that generation that now come in to read this information and now exploring, because we don't really know where to find a lot of it. I mean, I know it's in the libraries, but it helps to be pointed in the directions. And that's something Professor Mohammed has done. And then I'll just go on to the next chapter, which is very, which was interesting for me, which is, and I'll tell a little story, The Harder They Fall, Masculinity and the Cinematic Gaze. And what was so interesting about this is Prof is comparing Brokeback Mountain and The Harder They Come. But when I sat in class, Professor Mohammed was lecturing cinema and gender, and I would never forget, we all had to choose a film and present it, and somehow I ended up with Brokeback Mountain. And I never watched Brokeback Mountain before. And this is my first time watching that movie, and I had to present it in front of the class. But it's so interesting coming from there, where I was at learning about the male gaze, just, the approach to maybe just the idea of love and putting aside gender. And now to come in to read this chapter is another kind of almost full circle. And I really, sometimes I forget, because honestly, I have so much hours of just say maybe editing with Professor Mohammed, probably more than 10,000 hours. And when I read this, I'm like, oh, wow, all over again, I discover how brilliant Professor Mohammed is. And I just had one line I really loved in here was, that's something that I didn't even think about, but Prof had island style cowboy. And when you really look at Jimmy Cliff in The Harder They Come, you're like, oh my, yes, he was like an island cowboy, and that's so the ability to connect these two films was just incredible in terms of the writing and the exploration and understanding, because it's not two films that I might decide to compare, but when you read the writing, you begin to understand how, how it works together, and how that masculinity and femininity within kind of operates. So for me, and I'll just say this last part, Ivan is the heterosexual Jamaican male. The Harder They Come does not admit to any other dimension of sexuality than the heterosexual. This is consistent with Jamaican society, where the idea of the homosexuality among men is not only taboo, but attracts violent reaction. This comparison and representation of cowboy and giving us a certain context in cinema, because a lot of our Caribbean cinema hasn't been written about. So to me, this is very important for other filmmakers to read and to just understand. And then the next chapter, which was Recalibrating Male Gender Identity, a dialogue with men and masculinity. That was a conversation that me and Professor have been running, which was about, where do men now find or look to for masculinity? And I was kind of telling her, I really found that within music, like men looking, within music or the arts and entertainment is where people find in the ideas and concepts of what masculinity is, and trying to follow these artists. And, a lot of it could be negative. And then we were also saying that it does have the positive, but, the negative music with the violence and these different aspects, basically it becomes more mainstream. And I guess it's because that idea of masculinity is more attractive, right? This machismo type of, and the way women are treated, all these, but, so the music that might be more positive might be a little less, so yeah.
Indeed, Michael, what we're going to do is ask you to keep those thoughts. Yes, I was so taken by it, and I said, oh my God, I don't want to stop you, but save those thoughts, don't put them away, about what it means in masculinity and so forth. And I'm sure more will be said as we proceed, recognizing our colleagues. I just want to, of course, recognize our colleagues from NBU, Dr. Tonya Haynes, the current head, and also our colleagues from our CEO, Dr. Delia Bean. We are really pleased and thankful. We move now to Dr. Deborah McPhee, who will be talking about Section 4, Drafting Gender Equality Frameworks. Dr. McPhee has worked in the area of gender and development in Trinidad and Tobago, the wider Anglophone Caribbean, since 1998. And at the IGDS, she's been with the IGDS since 2005, and currently she holds the post of Research and Outreach Officer. Dr. McPhee has carried out extensive research and publication on gender-related themes, including women, gender and public policy, gender and human security, the impact of small arms and light weapons on women and girls in select communities in Trinidad. A major focus of her interest has been on the politics and process of gender policy making, gender justice, and the social change in the Caribbean. So I'm sure she will have valuable comments about drafting gender equality frameworks. Dr. McPhee?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, Head of Department, Dr. Ann Barratt of IGDS SAU, Professor Emerita, Professors Emerita, Professor Barriteau, Professor Mohammed. I know Professor Lee reminded me, and Professor Bailey are here. Good evening, and specially invited guests, fellow panelists. Thanks for being here with us today. Section 4 is, I would say, is my section. So I'm owning that section, Professor Mohammed, because of the time you've invested in teaching and reflecting with us around gender policymaking. So I'll start. What's in a name? That's my starting point. What's in a name? Professor Mohammed's work always compels me to spend time deliberating on that question. Whether she's invoking Rushdie trainings around midnight children, or she's calling on us to extend our perceptions on the elasticity of gender, or she's invoking Buju in My Love, My Browning. What's in a name is always an important point at which I reflect on Professor Mohammed's work. And this section 4 is no different, because when I looked at section 4, I said, for sure, it must be gender policy, something, something, something. But Professor Mohammed engaged us in gender equality framework to anchor our conversation about the Caribbean interactions with gender politics and global governance, global democracies. The other chapter was profiling the gender sensitivity of nations and the gender matrices, a guide for gender policy making. And what I appreciated with the issue was she stuck with the framework. So my first question really to deliberate on is why frameworks? Why frameworks? And I would like to pause here for us to reflect on. Professor Mohammed speaks to those of us who, and I'm quoting her, who operate outside of what can be the impenetrable fields of public policy, program evaluation, policy analysis, and public management. But yet we are here in the making of gender policy. And she reflects on them in the context of a framework. In my words, the frameworks become these critical points at which we, one, understand how and what we are engaged in as we seek to challenge governments and state machineries as linked entities at the national, regional, international, and global levels. The ways in which we compel states to grapple with these comfortable invisibilities, and the ways in which we call them to revisit this easy redeployment of aggregates as the basis of public policy making. Many times our framework becomes our entry point for understanding how these conversations must start. Professor Mohammed speaks to us when we talk about the frameworks, we're not exclusively talking about these products of schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Neither are we talking about that lovely book compiled by Candida March and Oxfam in 1999. No, we are talking about where we convene to understand and how we make meaning of what we see. And more importantly, who we decide to see as policy priorities, policy partners, stakeholders, and these purveyors of these complex processes. What is critical, and this is something I just like to peg as being very fundamental to the work, and I was reminded of it working with Professor Mohammed recently on one of our latest in my recasting of policy, a roadmap document, and it really compelled us to revisit and come up with our framework, not our framework, Professor Mohammed and myself, but the framework for the people for whom we were working for, whom we were in service to. And for us in the Caribbean, the idea of the framework provides for us that necessary disciplinary grounding and the respect for those complexities that we must engage with. When what Mohammed calls those assumed border crossings, the extent to which our gender, equity, and equality work will defy its boundaries. Much of that has to do with the ways in which we make space to collectively work with and work. Let me say that again. As we work on unpacking gender and feminism for governments and with populations, it is important that we work, we seek to engage these frameworks not only as a product, but also a process. So Mohammed speaks and the process is important. Mohammed speaks very much about the ways in which it is easy to bargain with people. I'm sorry, somebody just came in the room. She talks about bargaining with patriarchy to gain ground in the private sphere of the household, the family, and sexuality, where it's easy for persons to see the need for gender, but those border crossings that must happen within the work of these frameworks must challenge issues of monetary policy, security, global governance, and our latest challenge, climate change. These are the conversations that these frameworks allow us to reflect on as both process and product, the ways in which our gender equity goals and inequities exist, not in simple forms, but in compound interests. And so then I would just like to spend a few minutes on.
Well, Dr. McPhee, those few minutes, I would ask you to save for a little later. I know you have more, and then we will come back to it in the open conversation.
Okay, I appreciate that, Dr.
Yes, but we're taking you on that, recognizing that perspective, which is very valuable as we continue to muse. Thank you so much. We're moving swiftly along in our time this Friday evening. That was Dr. Deborah McPhee on drafting gender equality frameworks. Finally, we turn to section 5, and we turn to Professor Ann Barratt, who will be discussing gender and cultural storytelling. Professor Barratt is a professor of environmental arts and justice at York University in Toronto and author of Nature's Wild: Love, Sex, and Law in the Caribbean. He's curator of Wendy Nanan, currently on view at the Art Museum of the Americas in DC, and the forthcoming Everything Slackness in a Wreck, sexy title, at the Ford Foundation Gallery in New York. His companion touring exhibition, Nature's Wild, will debut in Port of Spain in early 2022. Professor Barratt.
Hey, you say is true. There's nothing you wouldn't do. Ah, the French people know the trick, so they have everybody licking. They say.
I thought we needed a little injection of Calypso tonight. And I didn't want to follow all those great presentations, so I thought Sparrow could instead. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. What a pleasure to be in this company, and what an honor to assemble for this reason. First, congratulations, Professor Mohammed. This body of work is just a partial testament to the tremendous contribution you've made to the intellectual history of the region and the development of Caribbean thought. And I feel certain we'll continue to grapple with the many foundational contributions you've made, not just in Caribbean studies and gender studies and sexuality studies, but across many fields. And I have to say, I'm always in awe of Professor Mohammed's comprehensive, multi and cross-disciplinary knowledge. And, you know, just from a cursory discussion of this tome, and it is a tome tonight, gives you just a small sense of that versatility. She is at once a scholar of philosophy and politics, literature and film, anthropology and art, and is as confidently adept at theorizing abstract expressions of gender and culture as she is effective in addressing the more pragmatic challenges of local and international governance. You know, and in addition to this, she's an artist and a filmmaker, and it's really just, this collection is such a fantastic testament to all of that work. And its very interdisciplinarity and multidimensionality sets her apart and offers an aspirational model for those of us seeking out this kind of richly layered dynamic engagement as researchers. So I just wanted to say that to begin with. So I get the lucky spot of sharing with you some notes on appreciation of the final section of the collection, which is focused on culture. 2 of the 4 essays consider gender in Calypso. They're the kind of wonderfully comprehensive considerations that reveal her to be both fan and critic. And while the other pair is representative of the foundational work Professor Mohammed has done in analysis of aesthetics and imagery. I thought the best use of the time today, because we only have 5 minutes, was to highlight a couple of excerpts from the text itself. And there are 2 at the very end of the collection that I found especially meaningful. But I have to say it was really enjoyable. You know, that first essay is such a wonderfully rich history of Calypso. And I was just, you know, I've been a fan of Calypso all my life. I used to make mixtapes from the radio from the age of 5. And it was just so riveting to also recognize how passionate she is about the form and the kind of critical lens she brings to it. So there's 2, in one section near the end of the tome, she says, there is a morality implicit in the act of remembering, reinventing, renaming. As a Trinidadian, I am part Asian, part African, part European, and part of everything else that has made up this small space during my lifetime. All the revolutions, upheavals, and changes wrought across the Caribbean are part of my history. But the aesthetics of racial anger only limit the potential for creativity that can absorb all of these into collective unconscious. So how do we build bridges across this divided conception of humanity? Is it part of an all too consuming search for identity in which we think we must choose between modernity and tradition, between Europe and the Caribbean, between Africa and Asia? If we look at history as less a parade of facts and more as a pattern which seeks to explain those facts, how do we begin to divide another philosophy of our history that exhumes and brings together its fragmented pieces and silenced passages into a new social order? How can we imagine a new world history that eschews ethnocentrism and the constipated concepts of race, class, and gender we have inherited? So I wanted to highlight this excerpt because it offers us a very clear sense of Professor Mohammed's politics and her approach to research. Her deep commitments to gender, racial, and other forms of justice drive for curiosity, and she understands culture as fluid and mobile. And I find it deeply comforting and resonant that in this final section of this book, she does not relegate her cultural landscape to just a few things that might be viewed as her natural domain in terms of her history, her personal history and where she lives. But she claims a broader set of culture, Calypso, European painting traditions, contemporary art as hers. And most importantly, I think she claims them with a critical eye, refusing to construct tradition or heritage as pure. As she puts it, there is no uncontaminated survival in the tangled nature of our lived experience, nor is this space fixed in time. And so the final quote I will leave you with comes right at the end of the collection's penultimate essay, The Indian Snake Charmer and Other Tales, the Image as Story. Here, Professor Mohammed makes clear her mission. She sees herself not as passive teller of history, but as active participant in the present and in the making of the future. Evident in her committed research on Calypso history in the first 4 of the essays in this collection, in her detailed reading of Sparrow's discography in the 3rd. And this was just a wonderful chapter because it's clear she adores Sparrow, but sees the fullness of Sparrow, you know, reads all the ambivalence of his text. And in the 3rd, her review of family and archival images. So yeah, Sparrow is the 2nd one. And in the 4th, the analysis of visual art is important in understanding and intervening at configurations of power now. As she puts it, I'm not concerned with writing back to empire about our pre and past history. Rather, I am interested in how we who live and work in the Caribbean, and perhaps those from the diaspora, take possession of an imaginary past. I'm interested in what else they convey about our knowledge of a past, of those of us who would become the inheritors of settled colonies. Thank you, Professor Mohammed, for wrestling with our past and toward the making of our better futures.
Thank you very much, Professor Gosine. So from Professor Barriteau's situating of this book, this writing of our history, writing in terms of building a discipline, as well as asserting an activism, to Professor Fox's contemplation of what it means for us in the Caribbean to claim and create a feminist space for theorizing, to Dr. Hosine's contemplation of what this text means for her in terms of the value of having this genealogy of writing on Indo-Caribbean women and feminism available to students and future scholars. And then to Mr. Mulida's contemplation of masculinity. What do these contemplations say to him as a filmmaker and a creative artist himself? And then Dr. McPhee's examination of the questions triggered as she evaluates frameworks as she herself asked. And finally, Professor Gosine drawing our attention to cultural elements that are always ever present in Professor Mohammed's work. We then open the floor for conversation. But let me say 2 things. You will engage with the presenters and what they have said and their own musings, but think of this as a book club. We're sitting, we're having a conversation. We cannot provide the wine, but if you have it in your fridge, go grab a glass. And we're going to have a conversation around these ideas that are shared. To make your point, ask a question, comment, etc. You can drop it in the chat, or you could put your hand up and share your view. We welcome you. We will be talking for a little bit of time, and we will signal when we have about 3 minutes and then 1 minute left. So for now, it's my pleasure to open the floor to all of our participants. Share your views in the chat or put your hand up and speak your truth, your understanding.